Welcome back to our little series we're doing here. In this second episode of our American Presidents series, we're going to look into the presidency of the second President of the United States, John Adams. Unlike previous times, we shall look in depth into the biography of the second President of the United States, as he is less widely known in comparison to George Washington because he was a one-term president. John Adams was born on October 30th, 1735 and died on July 4th, 1826. He was an American statesman, attorney, diplomat, writer, and founding father. Before the American Revolution in 1770, as an attorney he defended soldiers participating in the Boston Massacre, as no attorney in Boston wanted to come to their defense, fearing for reputation. John Adams did that as he personally believed that no person should be denied from the rights to counsel and a fair trial. After a long trial, John Adams was able to get all of the soldiers acquitted and let out free. Initially, he was one of the more conservative founding father figures, believing that 13 colonies should remain in the United Kingdom, but without the huge amount of taxes and control over them. However, his attitude started to change in 1772 as the Crown started asserting larger control over the judicial independence of the colonies. In 1774, at instigation of his cousin Samuel Adams, another important founding father dude, he was sent to First Continental Congress as representative of Massachusetts. There he contributed a lot to the work of the Congress by being the member of the committee that drafted a letter to King George, as well as being a member of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, where he worked with prominent founding father figures such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. During the American Revolutionary War, he was a member of the Second Continental Congress and took diplomatic posts in France and the Netherlands. Following American victory in the war, he was made the first minister to Great Britain, i.e. being the first American ambassador to the United Kingdom. When he returned to the United States, he was put on the ballot of the first ever presidential election, and due to coming second after George Washington, he was made the first Vice President of the United States and would serve for 8 years in that position. He would work actively in the Senate and pushed forward an idea of granting the President of the United States a title of the Protector of their United States liberties, in which, to be honest, does sound badass. But unfortunately, a lot of people in the Senate, anti-federalists, didn't really like this idea, as it sounded too monarchical, which makes sense, I guess. As Vice President, he was a close advisor to George Washington and took a more or less federalist position on things. Speaking of political parties, in the last video I forgot to mention that George Washington was highly against the creation of both the Federalist and Democratic Republican political parties, as he believed it would cause division in the country that would lead to an unintended consequences. That's what's called foreshadowing. Another point of division in the country was the Jay Treaty between UK and the United States, which many people saw as surrendering to the British, which increased the divide in the American society. After George Washington decided to not run for a third term, the 1796 election seemed to become the first competitive election in American history. The two main contenders were John Adams, who was nominated by Federalists as he agreed with their policies, and the former Secretary of State and John Adams' frenemy, Thomas Jefferson, who ran under the Democratic Republican ticket. John Adams won in this contested election, but due to the legislation of the time, Thomas Jefferson became his vice president as he came second. Bit awkward, in it. Now, with the prelude out of the way, we can talk about his presidency. The presidency of John Adams wasn't that successful and as eventful as George Washington's, as he served for president for only one term. In terms of the cabinet, John Adams chose to retain the cabinet left by George Washington, although he was never that close to them. Additionally, all of the cabinet members of the cabinet were under a very high influence of Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist Party, who, according to Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "they were only a little less hostile to him than to me," end quote. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were close friends since serving in the Second Continental Congress. On the eve of the inauguration, John Adams met Thomas Jefferson to discuss the possibility of sending him on a diplomatic mission to France. After they concluded that it was an improper post for a vice president, it was decided to send Jefferson's ally James Madison instead. However, later Jefferson informed Adams that Madison has rejected the proposal, to which Adams replied that he couldn't have sent Madison anyway, as he was pressured to put a Federalist in that post under the pressure of the cabinet. And that was the last time Adams consulted Jefferson on the question of national significance, which led to Jefferson turning exclusively to his role as the leader of the Democratic Republican Party and his duties in the Senate as the main presiding officer. As President of the United States, John Adams made 3 Supreme Court appointments, that being a politician from Virginia, Bushard, Washington, George Washington's cousin, and former Attorney General of North Carolina Alfred Moore as associated justices, with John Marshall, statesman, lawyer, and founding father, as Chief Justice. Originally, John Adams wanted to appoint John J. Back as Chief Justice, but he rejected this offer to remain in his public office as Governor of State of New York. During his presidency, John Adams would also make 15 appointments to circuit courts and 4 appointments to district courts. The Jay Treaty that was signed and ratified under George Washington's administration angered the French, leading their navy to start plundering the American merchant ships in the Atlantic. Due to the fact that pro-French sentiment was still relatively high, John Adams sent a commission consisting of John Marshall, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and Elbridge Gerry to negotiate compensation for attacked American ships. Upon arrival to Paris, the delegation had to wait several days until being granted a 15-minute meeting with French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, after which they met Talleyrand's agents, who told them that in order for negotiation to take place, they had to pay a bribe first to Talleyrand and then to the French Republic. The Americans refused to negotiate under such terms, so 2 of the delegation members left besides Gerry, who remained. In April of 1798, in a speech to Congress, John Adams revealed the machination of Talleyrand, sparking a public outrage against the French. This event will go down in history as the XYZ affair, a name that derives from the substitution of letter X, Y, and Z for the names of French diplomats in documents released by the Adams administration. This scandal led to an even further division in the American society as the Federalists began to pushing towards a legislation to increase funding of the military to combat a possible French aggression, while the Democratic Republicans were skeptical of the account of the events. In order to combat French assault on American interests, instead of siding with the British in war against the French, Adams decided to push forward a strategy of harassment of French ships by the US Navy to scare the French from attacking American interests in the future. Additionally, Adams took a Federalist position in terms of the fact that he asked Congress to authorize an expansion of the Navy, which led to Congress authorization of a moderate naval expansion and a 10,000-strong army. George Washington was made the senior officer of the Army, commander of the Army, with Hamilton being second in command under the request of Washington. Due to the expansion of the Navy and creation of the Department of Navy, Adams is sometimes referred to as father of the American Navy. These efforts paid off as the US Navy was able to achieve victories in the Quasi-War. With capture of L'Insurgent, a powerful French warship, and opening of trade relations with Saint-Dominique, which was a rebellious French colony. This conflict ended in 1800 with the Convention of 1800, which ended hostilities between France and the United States, after which the emergency army was disbanded. As per Residence Act of 1790, the capital would move to a site near the Potomac River in the federal land that would be donated from the states of Maryland and Virginia. The city was named after President Washington, and the federal district surrounding it was named Columbia, which was a poetic name for the United States, commonly in use at that time. Congress would adjourn its last meeting in Philadelphia on 15th of May 1800. The capital was moved from New York to Philadelphia temporarily in 1791, and Philadelphia would officially cease to be the nation's seat of government on June 11th. John Adams would be the first president to reside in the White House, and would move there on 1st of November, with his wife, First Lady Abigail Adams, arriving a week later. Upon arriving, Adams wrote to her, "Before I end my letter, I pray heavens to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Oh yeah, that aged as fine as wine. On 22nd of November, President Adams would deliver his fourth State of the Union address in the newly completed Senate chamber. This would be the last annual address delivered by the President personally to the Congress for the next 113 years. The following February, Congress approved the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1801, which officially organized the District of Columbia. In accordance with the Constitution, Congress became the district's governing authority. The United States became increasingly polarized by the Quasi-War, and Adams faced bitter attacks in the press. Many recent immigrants, including those from Ireland, looked favorably on the French and opposed the British. In an attempt to quell the threat of subversion among hostile immigrants, the Federalists in the House and the Senate passed a series of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. Historians still debate Adams' involvement beyond his signature. He denied seeking the acts in his memoirs, but his complaints about libelous attacks on his presidency may have played a role in the law's passage. The Alien and Sedition Acts consisted of four measures: the Naturalization Act, the Alien Friends Act, and the Alien Enemies Act, and the Sedition Act itself. These statutes were designed to mitigate the threat of secessionists by disallowing their most extreme firebrands. The Naturalization Act increased to 14 years the period of residence required for an immigrant to attain American citizenship, partly because naturalized citizens tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans. The Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act allowed the president to deport any foreigner whom he considered dangerous to the country. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. Punishments included 2 to 5 years in prison and fines of up to $5,000. If you thought immigration laws today are cruel, they are tame in comparison to this. To pay for the military buildup of the Quasi-War, Adams and the Federalists in Congress enacted the Direct Tax of 1798. Direct taxation by the federal government was widely unpopular, and the government's revenue had mostly come from excessive taxes and tariffs. The Direct Tax of 1798 instituted a progressive land value tax of up to 1% of the value of a property. Taxpayers in eastern Pennsylvania resisted federal tax collectors, and in March of 1799, the bloodless Fry's Rebellion broke out, led by Revolutionary War veteran John Fries. Rural German-speaking farmers protested that they saw as a threat to their republican liberties and to their churches. The subsequent trial of Fries gained nationwide attention. Adams pardoned Fries and two other rebels after they were sentenced to be executed for treason. The rebellion, the deployment of army, and the results of the trial alienated many in Pennsylvania and other states from the Federalist Party, damaging Adams's re-election hopes. Throughout his life, Adams disliked slavery and refused to own any slaves. In 1800, the Slave Trade Act of 1800 restricted the international trade in slaves, and Adams signed it into law on May 10, 1800. It built upon the Slave Trade Act of 1794, limiting American involvement in the trade of human cargo. Just as the election of 1796, the election of 1800 was very competitive. Due to new taxes, a more or less pro-British foreign policy, and the fear that the new army created by Adams' administration would go against the people and instill tyranny, Thomas Jefferson was able to narrowly beat John Adams, thus ending John Adams's presidency. This was the first election where presidents picked their running mate, so there was no similar funny business as that which happened in 1796. Although unpopular near the end of his presidency, historians today view John Adams more or less favorably, and in 2017 C-SPAN survey showed that 91 presidential historians ranked Adams 19th among 43 former presidents, with later surveys putting him 13th. He is remembered today as an independent-minded leader who disagreed with both parties and implemented policies he saw best, no matter the backlash he would receive. Due to this, we can say, in conclusion, that John Adams is definitely in the category of good American presidents.